Hello, my name is Nick Swinehart. I'm the Managing Director of Instructional Technology at the University of Chicago Language Center. I am very grateful to the Texas Language Center at the University of Texas at Austin for inviting me to give this presentation today. The title of my presentation is On a Quest to Evaluate Generative AI for Language Teaching Tasks. So we'll get right into it with a quick preview. So first I'll give a little introduction, then I'll talk about defining the task or tasks, and then the importance of evaluation, human versus automated evaluation, the Quest framework for human evaluation of generative AI, which comes from an article from the healthcare field, and then modifying and applying that framework for language learning and teaching, and then some key takeaways. Okay. So the main question I'll be talking about today is how well does a generative AI tool work? Okay. This is a seemingly simple question that I'm going to spend the next 20 to 30 minutes talking about and breaking down, but this is kind of the motivating question here. So let's suppose a language teacher wanted to use ChatGPT to generate text for reading practice, or have learners use an AI voice chatbot for speaking practice. I think anytime we're talking about generative AI in education and language teaching, there are ethical, privacy, environmental concerns. Some people, are very concerned with authenticity. I think all of these are important questions, but today we're going to focus on the question of how well do these tools work, how can that be measured, and how can instructors make decisions about the effective use of AI tools based on how well they work, right? So this is the kind of evaluation we're talking about today. So first, defining the task or tasks. So generative AI is a general purpose technology, right? We can think of it kind of like this Swiss Army knife here, although one difference is that with the Swiss Army knife, there's kind of a limited number of things that you can do with the Swiss Army knife, whereas with generative AI, there's really not a limit on the number of ways we could use it in language teaching or language learning. So I think instead of just saying ChatGPT or other tools like ChatGPT is good or bad at language teaching, or it's good or bad in my language, I think we have to be a little more specific than that. And so the title of this presentation is On a Quest to Evaluate Generative AI for Language Teaching Tasks, right? So we're not just talking about ChatGPT or Google Gemini, but we're talking about specific tasks. So if we want to talk about how well does an AI tool work, I think it's better to think of how well does this tool perform this task. So again, not just ChatGPT, but it could be a custom GPT where you put in specific instructions and you add custom knowledge and you give it, and then you're creating this little mini bot that people can interact with. Or it could be a specialized tool, for example, Speakology, TalkPal, JumpSpeak. These are all products that are intended to help language learners do the kind of oral speaking practice I talked about on the previous slide. So there's tons of web apps out there that use AI to perform specific tasks like this. Or we could be evaluating ChatGPT, but in order to do a specific task, for example, creating texts for a reading test or reading practice, right? So being specific with what we're talking about evaluating. So takeaway, I'm going to have a series of takeaways throughout the presentation. Takeaway number one is to evaluate generative AI for language teaching, you have to clearly define the task or tasks. Next is the importance of evaluation. So why evaluate? First, let's think about why use generative AI at all in language teaching. Typically, some of the big categories might be doing things more efficiently, doing things better, or creating new opportunities for language practice that maybe we don't have without using these tools. So I think if we want to do those things, we need to know how effective a tool is at doing those. And we need to monitor potential problems regarding generative AI in language teaching. For example, some problems we might run into is the tool, the AI, the chatbot's ability to follow instructions. Hallucinations. I've heard somewhere that these generative AI tools are more concerned with sounding right than with being right. And so we have to make sure that they are conveying the right information, that they're doing the things that we want them to be doing. And then performance in and knowledge of languages other than English. So these tools typically perform in languages related to their training data, so that most of their training data is in English, so they perform better in English. And so depending on the language that you teach, you know, it may perform better or worse in your language, and that's another thing that we have to monitor and evaluate. I think it's important, the importance of evaluation varies for different contexts, different uses, and different users. And I'll talk about this kind of throughout this presentation. And this is especially important, evaluation is especially important when creating or selecting AI tools for other users, like learners. So you've probably heard the term human in the loop. This usually means human oversight or supervision of generative AI. Which having a human in the loop is important, but having direct, constant oversight is not always possible or practical. You know, if we're using a voice chatbot for extra student practice, we can't be there all the times that students are using it, because that kind of defeats the whole purpose of trying to give them speaking opportunities when the teacher isn't around, right? So, for example, using ChatGPT to generate text for reading practice. If I'm the instructor and I'm doing that for my own texts that I'm going to use in my classes, then I'm constantly checking and modifying each text. And so therefore, informal and implicit evaluation is fine in those situations, in my opinion, right? Whereas if you're having learners use an AI voice chatbot for speaking practice, where there is no oversight once the tool is actually being deployed, then there's increased importance of evaluation before deployment, right? So takeaway number 2 is an inverse relationship between the importance of evaluation and the amount of oversight. Meaning, or for example, if there's minimal oversight, if it's going to be used by learners without the teacher present, then evaluation is essential. I'll talk a little bit about human versus automated evaluation. So most of the evaluation of large language models, or LLMs, which are of course the brains behind these generative AI tools, most of the evaluation of LLMs by AI companies and AI researchers is automated. It can be more objective, more scalable, meaning they can do that thousands of times within an instant. They can run it across different LLMs, different environments, and it easily gives you, some nice quantitative statistics that you can put up on your website or in a PDF or in an article, right? So for example, we're talking about evaluating an LLM's multilingual capabilities. There's this test or framework called the Massive Multitask Language Understanding Benchmark. And so that is 16,000 multiple choice questions across 57 subjects. And so AI companies often machine translate that into various languages, and then they deploy that test on their LLM, right? So this is a few years old. This is from GPT-4, but this is GPT-4's performance in these languages on this 16,000 question multiple choice test, right? Translated in these different languages. And so OpenAI is intending to use this to convey how well GPT-4 does in all these different languages, right? But what does this tell us about how well an LLM generates text in a language or performs other tasks? I would say next to nothing, right? And so, okay, Korean scored, looks like 77.0%. Okay, that's a 0.5 percentage better than Icelandic. That's great, but otherwise, what does that tell us? I would say not much. On the other hand, human evaluation is slower, can be more expensive. It requires training and calibration across evaluators, assuming you have more than one evaluator. It can be more subjective, which I think can be good or bad, depending on the context. But I think making decisions about what tools or materials to use in your teaching is subjective, right? So the best person for you to decide what's right for your classroom is you, right? So I think that the subjectivity is not a big problem. Again, the big question is, how well does this tool work for your learners or in your course on this task in this context? The best person to evaluate that is you, in my opinion. So takeaway number 3 is decrease the distance between the user and the evaluator as much as possible. If it's going to be used by students, can we get students in the evaluation process at some point? They're having the student's instructor be the one to evaluate it. The students themselves, again, decreasing the distance between user and evaluator. Now I'll talk about the Quest framework for human evaluation of generative AI. So the Quest framework comes from an article titled "A Framework for Human Evaluation of Large Language Models in Healthcare Derived from Literature Review." So again, this comes from the field of healthcare. And I think that studying other fields like healthcare is important because, for better or worse, higher education and language learning, language teaching in particular, we are behind some other fields when it comes to generative AI. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think higher ed is very deliberate, trying to be very deliberate and very careful with these things in ways that some other industries aren't. But I think healthcare is careful and deliberate generally, but they also want to find, if they can find tools that are going to make doctors better doctors or that are going to help save people's lives, then they want to try to explore those tools, right? But in a careful way. And so that's why I think that looking at something from healthcare can be beneficial for us in language education. This article, I would strongly recommend reading this article when you get the chance. It has a nice lit review that talks about generative AI in healthcare, which obviously is not directly related to what we're talking about here, but it does give an overview of the types of uses and kind of ways that it's being evaluated. It also talks a little bit about human versus automated evaluation, and it has a few case study examples. But two things we're gonna look at are, it's got 5 principles and 17 dimensions of evaluation, and it's got a pretty practical framework that we're going to talk about both of these things and kind of look at them in the light of language teaching and learning. So the 5 evaluation principles, and this is where the name Quest comes from. So the 5 principles are the quality of information, understanding and reasoning, expression, style and persona, safety and harm, trust and confidence. Okay, those 5 principles are then broken down into 17 dimensions with some dimensions within each principle. So I'm not going to read through all these. Go ahead and pause the video and take a look at this for just a second. Okay, welcome back. And then, okay, so there's 17 different dimensions here that could be evaluated. This comes directly from the article where here you see the principles, then here you see the dimensions, and then we have some example questions for evaluators. So again, these are all related specifically to healthcare, but you can kind of get some examples of what kind of things might be looked at within each of these dimensions, right? So I'm going to come back to this slide, and I'm going to say, let's go back to our question of, again, the main question was, how well does a generative AI tool work, right? I think that looking at these 17 dimensions kind of highlights the fact that when we're talking about how well something does something, there are many different ways we can look at that. Here's 17, and these 17 are not even exhaustive or comprehensive because these are all come from a healthcare article. And while it looks like all of these things, I think, are somewhat relevant to language teaching, there are other things that are maybe more relevant to language teaching that aren't on this list, right? So if we are going to think about using the Quest principles to evaluate generative AI for language teaching tasks, I think first we need to add or remove or modify some of those principles and dimensions to make it more relevant to language teaching, or add the ones that are relevant to language teaching but aren't in those. So for example, linguistic accuracy, right? Especially when it comes to languages other than English, how well and how accurate, and again, saying linguistic accuracy or how well does it do in your language, there are lots of sub-dimensions within that, right? Authenticity, and that could be linguistic authenticity, pragmatic authenticity, cultural authenticity, interactional authenticity. Again, lots of things we could look at here when it comes specifically to language teaching and learning. And then level fit, if we are trying to generate materials for specific learners who are at or around a specific level, and if we try to convey that to our AI tools, how well do they follow those guidelines? So after we've done that, then we've already talked about what tasks we're doing, right? Then we need to think about and identify which dimensions are the most important or the highest priority for your tasks or in your context, right? Again, there was 17 on the other page, and here's a few more, and there's undoubtedly more that could be added. So which are the most important for your task or in your context? We could think of those as our evaluation criteria. And then we need to design an evaluation that measures the selected criteria, that is adequate, measures it adequately or does enough evaluation, and that is practical. This obviously is the hard part, and we'll spend the rest of this time talking about these things. So takeaway number 4 is that you can't evaluate everything. You need to select the evaluation dimensions that are most important for your tasks and your context. So for some examples of identifying evaluation dimensions. So if we go back to our reading text generator, some of the important dimensions might be linguistic accuracy, right? I mean, like I said, if I'm the instructor and I can do some oversight and editing to make sure it's appropriate. But still, if it's complete gibberish, or if the errors are so prevalent that it's not worth it for me to use it, that's a problem. Same thing with level fit. I can tweak it a little bit, but hopefully it's going to be in the ballpark of what we're looking for. And then authenticity. I mean, like I said, I know some people are very concerned about authenticity. Personally, I think authenticity varies. The importance of authenticity varies from at lower levels. I think textbook language is not very authentic, but then as learners progress and get to higher levels, then yes, authenticity becomes very important. Our other example was a speaking practice chatbot. There, I would say some of the most important dimensions are its ability to follow instructions, right? If we are kind of trying to use it as a language partner and we're trying to design specific tasks and we're giving the chatbot instructions that we want it to follow when working with learners, how well does it follow those instructions? Other things that might be looked at are things like pronunciation, pragmatics. I would say again that I think the importance of those things varies by level or by task. I think at lower levels we just want students to have more opportunity speaking, but of course it needs to be intelligible and sound pretty good. But then again, as we get to higher levels, maybe pragmatics become more important, right? One example we haven't talked about yet is, let's say we have a syllabus or a textbook assistant, right? What are the important dimensions there? I would say the accuracy of the information there becomes very important. If here in our reading text, maybe it's generating stories, and so if the story is crazy or not factual, that's not important. But here, if we're trying to find information and answer students' questions about something that should be in the syllabus, we need that information to be accurate, right? And then again, it's the chatbot's ability to follow instructions. For example, you might tell this kind of chatbot to say, answer the question, but also give a citation, so the students are told to then go look at the specific page and confirm that. Or you could tell the chatbot to say, I don't know if the information is not explicitly said in the syllabus or textbook. And so how well does the chatbot follow those instructions versus just trying to make up an answer to please the user? Okay, so examples of some of the important dimensions depending on the task we're talking about. So we've identified the task or tasks. We've identified the most important evaluation dimensions or criteria. So now, how can we measure the tool's performance against that criteria? This framework here comes from the same article, the Quest framework article we've been talking about. It's an evaluation design framework that here in a second we'll look at in more detail. But first I want to talk a little bit about how much evaluation is necessary or adequate or practical. Like I said earlier, you can tell just by looking at this, there's a lot going on in this framework. And I'm not saying that every time you use generative AI related to your teaching, you need to run a full study like this, right? I know that's not practical. So we cannot do a full research study for every use of generative AI. Like I said before, the importance of evaluation varies by context, by its use, by who's using it. There's also a degree of risk management here where if we're defining risk as unintended negative consequences, in my opinion, reading text, if we're generating reading text, and again, if I'm kind of going through and making sure everything looks good, then that's fairly low risk, right? Versus the voice chatbot is higher risk in terms of students might be learning the wrong things, or if the chatbot kind of has some bad behavior, it's doing things we don't want, that could be harmful. And then just ultimately, if students don't view it as legitimate, if it doesn't work well and students think it's stupid, then that might harm kind of their view of our legitimacy as instructors and our ability to help them find effective practice, right? So some evaluation strategies. So going back to how can we measure these things? In the article, the Quest Framework article, it talks about, most of what it talks about is comparative analysis. So comparing LLM outputs against human-generated responses. So that question might be, is the LLM as good as a human at doing this thing? Can use gold standards. So you might say, here is a gold standard of what a reading text should look like. Or if you're going to use these tools for assessment or feedback, you could say, this is what the ideal either text looks like, or this is what the ideal version of the feedback looks like. Comparing these outputs against other LLM generated outputs. So which LLM or which instructions or prompts performs better is something that people could be looking at. And then in the article, it talks about comparing LLM outputs against established clinical guidelines, which obviously here we're not talking about clinical guidelines so much as, but it could be proficiency guidelines, or it could be comparing the output against our ad hoc task or material descriptions, right? If we say, here's the instructions, here's what I want you to do, I want you to generate this type of material, or this is the task that you're supposed to be doing, and then we create how well does it perform against our description of what we're telling it to do. Of course, another learning or another evaluation strategy is looking at learning outcomes, thinking, if we're using this tool to help learners learn the language, is this tool effective in helping learners develop language proficiency? That's another potential evaluation strategy. But I would say that, in this case, it's often hard to separate the tool from the curriculum or the task design, like how students are using the tool and how that fits in the overall curriculum. But also, I think there needs to be some evaluation that takes place before student use or before you embark on an empirical study of learning outcomes, right? Before you do all that, you need to make sure that it's doing what you are intending it to do. Some evaluation tools, so some things that we can use to help us with those strategies. In the article, it talks about using Likert scales, using a rubric or a checklist. There's often blinded and sometimes unblinded assessment. So it might be if we're evaluating the reading text here, there's a mixture of human and LLM generated reading text, but the evaluators don't know which is which, for example. And then again, objective versus subjective ratings. Objective ratings need more training and more calibration to make sure that all the raters are rating in the same way, versus if you want to just kind of see how learners or instructors feel about something, or if they view it as appropriate or useful, then that's a little more subjective, but that's still valuable in our evaluation, I think. So again, the question is, how can we measure the tool's performance against our criteria? Unfortunately, there's no one-size-fits-all answer, and that comes down to the art and science of evaluation design. So this is from the article again. So here, once again, we have the principles, the dimensions that we've talked about. We've also got definitions, related concepts, but the point here is a column of evaluation strategies. And so for each dimension, it's got some examples of evaluation tools or strategies that could be used to kind of work back and evaluate this dimension, right? So again, I encourage you to go take a look at this. Okay, now we're going to talk about the evaluation design framework in more detail as promised. So this framework is going to provide us some structure, some guidance, but also I think we can adjust it to fit our context as needed, right? We don't need to follow this dogmatically. And so the big picture, the phases are first the planning phase, the implementation and adjudication phase, and then the scoring and review phase. So within the planning phase, first there's evaluation planning, where the evaluator. So here I'm going to be using an LLM or a generative AI to perform certain tasks, and I want to evaluate that. So first I define the goals. What is it I'm trying, big picture, what am I trying to do? Then the task, what task am I having the generative AI perform? Who are the stakeholders? Meaning who's going to be using it, who's going to be affected by its use, and then the success criteria. I'll talk about success in a little bit, but for now we'll just think of how well does this tool need to perform in order for you to use it. That would be our success criteria. We'll talk more about that. Okay, next, output sample selection. Determine the number of output samples to be evaluated. Here they're saying 130 or 100 or 100. I think most people watching this video, in most cases, it's going to be a fairly informal study or informal evaluation of what you're doing. So obviously more samples is better. I would say with the reading text or with in the example we're talking about, if you can do 5 to 10 samples, just meaning, so if it's the voice chatbot, you design the instructions, you go through that with the voice chatbot and make sure it's doing what you want it to do. If you do that 5 to 10 times, and then you evaluate how well it did your evaluation criteria, I think then you have a pretty good idea of how it performs. And then, so develop a standard. So next is evaluation checklist and setup. Develop a standardized evaluation checklist and guidelines. Again, going back to all the things we talked about, Likert scale, rubrics, all those different strategies and tools. Again, the question of how can we measure the tool's performance against our criteria. And then determine the number and background of evaluators. Again, in many cases, the number might just be 1 if it's just you, the instructor. But if it's going to be a bigger thing, if you're going to use this tool more often, or it's a little higher stakes use, or if you're going to try to publish about it, you might have research partners or colleagues or students involved in the evaluation too. Okay, next in the implementation and adjudication phase is basically executing the evaluation. Pretty self-explanatory there. And then final scoring. Calculate the final evaluation scores for each dimension. And then once we kind of finish that process, and we kind of have the results of our evaluation, then we can make decisions about using the tool. And I'll talk more about that. So again, like I said, I'll talk more about defining success. Once again, say it with me, that depends on the context, and there's no one-size-fits-all answer for that. In this syllabus assistant example, I would say success there is nearly, maybe exactly 100% accuracy, right? I mean, if the tool can't be relied on to successfully either retrieve the correct information or say, I don't know, if it's not doing that nearly 100% of the time, then I would probably not use it. On the other hand, if it's a reading text generator with constant oversight and editing, it's kind of hard to, in my opinion, it's hard to quantify what the percentage or what the success exactly needs to be for that, right? It kind of, to me, it's a little bit more of like is using this and editing it, is that more beneficial for me, more efficient for me as an instructor than trying to find the perfect text online or trying to write the text myself? So again, is using this tool more efficient than performing this task in other ways? Is a little more of a fuzzy definition of success on some things. So I think the goal here, we're not necessarily expecting perfection, although up here I said in some cases we might want perfection. Not always expecting perfection, but we do want to understand and communicate a tool's strengths and weaknesses. I think first impressions can be important, and so if you say, hey, we're going to use this tool, and here you go, let's go use it, and then right off the bat, students think it doesn't look or sound the way that they thought it would, then I think they can kind of lose faith in the tool right away. But so if we can kind of say, look, I know the voice sounds a little robotic, it sounds a little robotic, but you should still use it. I think it's good to use for these reasons, then I think that way we kind of get out in front of those first impressions. And then we can, once we know these strengths and weaknesses, we can maximize the strengths and minimize the weaknesses. Back to the question of how much evaluation is necessary. There needs to be some balance and alignment between lots of different things we've talked about in terms of evaluation criteria, the uses and the users, the amount of oversight, the risks or the stakes involved, the practicality. And so ultimately at the end, we need to know the strengths and weaknesses, and we need to have confidence in the reliability of the tool. And we need to weigh how much evaluation do you need to get these things here, the confidence and the reliability of the tool, weighing that against how much evaluation can you do with the constraints of practicality in terms of your time, your resources. Like I said, we can't do a full research project for everything we're thinking about doing with generative AI. So takeaway number 5 is evaluation design involves finding the best way to measure the tool's performance against your criteria, given practicality constraints. And takeaway number 6 is the end product of evaluation of AI tools for language teaching tasks is understanding the tool's strengths and weaknesses, your confidence in the tool's reliability or lack thereof, and then using that to make informed decisions about the appropriate use of the tool. Okay, now we're going to bring it all back home. And so some examples of using evaluation to make informed decisions about the use of AI tools. Back to our reading text generator, right? Let's say I do a fairly informal evaluation because I'm going to be keeping an eye on everything. Like I said, one of the dimensions was level fit. Okay, I do some evaluation of how well it fits the level that I'm asking for, and that's pretty good. Linguistic accuracy is okay, not perfect, but I can clean things up as I go. In the end, maybe using this tool is more efficient and better than performing the task in some other ways, the same task in other ways. And if I think there's minimal risk involved in this type of use, then to me, that's a green light. I'm going to go ahead and use the tool in that manner, right? When it comes to the speaking practice chatbot that we talked about, again, we said our evaluation dimensions might be its ability to follow instructions, its linguistic accuracy, and its pragmatic competence, if we pick these three as our most important dimensions. Our evaluation design, since we're using learners, we might want to do a little more formal evaluation. So the design might be, I write instructions for the chatbot, specifying the type of interaction, the learner's level, the amount of feedback I want it to give, the length of the conversation, anything else I want to tell the chatbot on what it should be doing. I then create a rubric or Likert scale questions that I or other instructors, or maybe down the road my students, can use to evaluate the tool's performance against my criteria. And then I run my experience X number of times and tally my results. If I can get other people to do it, I get them to fill out the rubric too. And so then, let's say in the end, after we do all that, its ability to follow instructions, it's poor. Let's say we told it to give feedback at the end. We told it to, choose from these role play scenarios and then follow these other instructions. It doesn't do that very well. Therefore, it's useless for us because we can't just have students go on there and just, the goal is not to have them, if you don't have clear instructions coming from the tutor, then things can go in different directions, and students can not know how to use it, how to have a productive conversation with a conversation partner, right? So if it can't follow instructions, maybe we would say that's a red light. Right now, we're going to stop using it. Or we could try to improve its ability we could change our instructions, find other ways that it follows instructions better. Another dimension was linguistic accuracy. If it can't communicate very well in your language, then that's obviously a red light, and we're going to stop using this tool. If the pronunciation sounds robotic but is understandable, that I would say maybe is a yellow light, where depending on the context and depending on how your needs in terms of students' ability to practice and opportunities to practice, I would say that's a yellow light. Maybe you use it despite the fact that the pronunciation is not perfect, right? Pragmatic competence. How good or bad is it? Okay, so it might not be perfect. How good or how bad is it? And what level are the learners? And so this one I think is not necessarily a simple yes, no. It's kind of like what's the spectrum and what do we need? And again, how do we define success in this area? Okay, so let's go back up here and let's say its ability to follow instructions was pretty good. Let's say its linguistic accuracy was pretty good. It sounded a little robotic, but otherwise, it's no worse than like a classmate of these students who are fairly low. They can understand what the chatbot is saying. The pragmatic competence is okay. Then the instructor might say, okay, our oral proficiency test is coming up. I strongly suggest you use this tool for practice. You say, here's what it does well, here's what it struggles with, and here's why I think it's beneficial for you to use it to prepare for the test, despite its flaws. Okay, so here again, we're wrapping up. Here are our key takeaways. I've talked about all these already, so I'm not going to read through them all right now. But in conclusion, I will talk about the final one here, that the end product of evaluation of AI tools for language teaching tasks, and the whole reason, I've been talking for about 35 minutes now, is to understand these tools' strengths and weaknesses, to measure our confidence and measure the tool's reliability or lack thereof, and then to use that to make informed decisions about the appropriate use of an AI tool. Okay? All right, here are some references. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you to the Texas Language Center for inviting me to give this presentation. And if you have any questions, if you want to talk about anything, please reach out to me, okay? Thank you so much.